Okay, take 486 at this point. Thankfully, this is the first time you're having to watch this, but this keeps wanting to freeze up on me every time. So this is like my 500th time saying this towards my computer. So bear with me as I try to get it all straight again. Anyway, hey, I hope you're well wherever this finds you. And I hope things are off to a good start. As promised last week, when I gave kind of the basic intro video, it was just a real quick flyover of everything. I basically promised I will be giving more explicit instruction, guidance, clarification, whatever, as we make our way through. And we're already knee deep in it, aren't we? We're sitting at the end of week 2 already, as you know. So I want to kind of take stock of right where we're at. And where we're at right now is right on the cusp of really taking some of the big strides into the project that you're working on. So I want to make sure right at this front end that we get some really big ideas totally straight, make sure we're on the same page, because these things are going to be very important when you're going to be making a lot of choices and decisions along the way. And so, as I sort of described last week, the way that this is set up is that it's going to be this very step by step, right, gradual accumulation where in a 10-week period, we are smashing in a lot of work. And so at this stage, the first lab that you were working on, I'm working on those and getting those back to you as quickly as I can, pardon me. It's getting you acquainted with, familiarized, comfortable in diving into these databases, exploring the literature, navigating around, utilizing the resources, the tools, the various pathways and things to find the kinds of things that you need and want to find. And it's like riding a bicycle. It's something, it takes time, it takes practice. You just immerse yourself. And over time, you become much, much, much more comfortable and familiar with what that's like. Hopefully, these initial exercises are helping to do that to some degree. Some of you will already be semi familiar with doing this anyway, some of you not at all. So please let me know if you do encounter problems or need, a boost, help, whatever along the way. But in terms of navigating that literature, finding the articles that are relevant, that are meaningful, that are informative to the ideas that you have at this point. Hopefully, you're finding either by working through the various authors, the citations within the target article, keywords that either you're self generating, knowing what your interests are, or even better, finding target articles or a couple of articles that do speak to the ideas that you have, and then figuring out what's the nomenclature look like in that field. I do research on self-control, for instance, is one of the places I do research. And I had done everything, I'd read everything in the freaking world ever published on self-control. And I went over to Austria and was giving a talk, and a faculty member came up to me after the fact and was just like, "Oh, you'd be really interested to look into this other literature on patience." And when I went and found it, it was a whole massive body of literature looking at exactly the same thing that I was interested in, except I was getting everything from basically North America that was published on self-control and missing the totality of the literature from Europe and from a lot of other countries where they just simply use the term patience as a definition for the same construct that I was interested in. I only tell you that to express the idea that if you're not finding what you think you should be finding, it's probably not because it doesn't exist. It's a matter of finding the right tools to get you there. And that's not always clear. So as you go through the articles, find the terminology that they're using, the lexicon that's associated with it, the authors and the people who are the movers and shakers in these areas that are of interest to you, and use those different ways to try and like kind of triangulate, to be a little more exacting in terms of finding what you're trying to find. That's very easy for me to say, harder to do. So if you're struggling with that, if you want a little helping hand or some guidance or whatever, like, let me know. That's why I'm here. At any rate, all of that, as you are seeing this week, for instance, with this lab, you hopefully have isolated your target article, sort of the article that relates best to your interest, your idea. And then kind of one part of that, of course, is summarizing it. So you're prompted to go through and kind of extract the salient pieces. What about the methods? How did they do it and why? How did they measure these things? How did they define them? What did they mean? What was their rationale? And in addition to just looking at that singular article and then basically trying to get you're probably familiar with APA style papers, but really getting into each of the sections. How do they flow? What is presented? How is it presented? How is an argument, a rationale, a justification constructed? How do you make a hypothesis that's specific? All of these things, and as you start to pull, it asks you to do a couple of other articles, right? Completely open as to what direction you want to go with that. You can just find another article that's by the same author or on the same exact topic. But ideally, you're thinking about this particular topic and how it relates to whatever you're interested in, right? It's your question. So as you start to pull these disparate things from the literature, and then what we're going to build towards, and this will take time and practice and all that too, but is like weaving that literature together into a coherent, synthesized, integrated, singular conversation that makes sense. So we're only at the front end of that now. So as you obtain these articles, as you are teasing out the pieces you're being asked to, making sense of the methods and the measurements and the relevant pieces to the methodology of the studies, hopefully that is kind of making its way into the percolator in your head of what your question might look like. What have been the limitations? What has been found, but what hasn't been consistent? Or what is a logical next step, right? When you get down to the discussion sections of any particular paper, that's one of the things they should be speaking to. It would be interesting to now take this next step. This follows from this. Future research should endeavor to blah, 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 right? They present ideas about different directions this stuff could go. At any rate, what I'm driving at is sort of the capstone of this week's lab. The last bit is to say, great, state what you're interested in doing as a research project for this term. Now understand, this is meant to be a very rough idea at this point. It doesn't need to be a well-refined, explicit hypothesis stated in precise operational terms and all of this. It can be very rough around the edges. It can be murky and foggy. That is fine, and that's expected right now. But as we start taking the next steps here in the coming days and weeks, of course, what we're going to do is we're going to refine that greatly and come up with an idea of precisely what the question is that comes from that interest. So anyway, for what it's worth, that's why I say at this point, please know you shouldn't have all the answers yet. That's not where we're at. Now, in addition to that, you're going to find that, as I've already alluded to last week, there's a lot of changes, not just the text for the course and all of that, but we are living in COVID times, and how. And so a lot has changed over these past few years. And you're going to still find vestiges of the course from when it was a face-to-face course with a lab, and we're working together, and there's graduate students as teaching assistants, and we all can do this. And in that wonderful world that we used to inhabit, there was a push to say, if you can do experimental, that would be preferable. design an experimental design, manipulate a variable, implement controls, account for confounds, and try to elucidate cause and effect. Now, if you still wish to do that, there are avenues for that. Every term, I still have people that will devise an experimental idea. Usually they'll execute it via computer rather than face-to-face because, again, when I come to sampling, the idea of trying to recruit, number one, just a sufficient number of people who are going to be willing to participate, but then also the idea of physically having to come to a location and spend their time, energy, and everything else into a study. There are a lot of practical issues surrounding that. So even though you're going to find language that dissuades you from doing something that is correlational, something like that, please know that in our current reality, correlational research is way okay to do. And high 90 some percent of projects over these past couple of years have been explicitly correlational research, and that's been absolutely acceptable. There's a balance to be found between keeping it simple and straightforward and something that's tenable in these weeks to come and with all the limitations imposed within that, and then also doing a sufficiently decent project. It's not an easy medium to find. I know that all too well. The best sort of guidance that I can give at this stage is that, to do something correlational is perfectly acceptable. I want to look at the relationship between X and Y. And instead of experimentally manipulating these things and controlling and randomly assigning and all that sort of a thing, I just want to get a measure on this topic, a measure on this topic, a measure on this thing, gather that data, and then we can play statistics on it and discern the patterns and all of that. That's great. Now, we'll go through every one of your projects individually, you and I will. As a generalized rule of thumb right now, if I were just trying to get you off on the right foot, too simple is possible. So if your question is, I want to look at the association between how much sleep somebody gets and how many symptoms of depression they would report. That's interesting. And there's probably 8 gajillion papers out there looking at this in different ways. But this is just a bivariate, this measure, and I ran a Pearson's R on it. That's probably a little overly simplistic for what we want to be doing here. That's something I would force my research students to do over a weekend as a lab in a former life at a different place and all that. But let's say we wanted to look at, I shouldn't make this stuff up on the fly like this, but whatever. Let's say we want to look at symptoms of depression, and particularly as they pertain to sociality, extroversion, and some of that. We can find measures about that and see if it differentially manifests itself in different personality characteristics. All right, that's a completely legitimate question. So maybe what we do is we look at some literature on the relationship between depressive symptoms and, openness to social situations and extroversion and introversion. And maybe we can find a few things that kind of measure those out. And then additionally, there's a gajillion different ways to measure so-called personality. Well, maybe we go with something that uses the Big 5 factor model. I won't dive into that now, but we break apart personality into these 5 continua. And so great, we find a measure that a person can fill out online that pertains to the Big 5 personality characteristics. We find a measurement tool that pertains to symptoms associated with depression and maybe some kind of a social engagement or extroversion introversion scale. And then we sort of construct these things in a way where at the end of the day, when we get our data back, now we have not just are you depressed or not, and are you an introvert or an extrovert, and then just try to determine this bivariate comparison, but we have a more nuanced picture, right? We can look at not just personality, but we can look at these 5 different continua. People who score high on extroversion here, that relates to depression in this way, and the depression symptoms over here relate to neuroticism on the scale over here, or openness to experience, and we can run these data. I know that on the front end, for most of you, I mean, if you guys are like most every other course I've ever had forever, you're thinking about the statistics part and going, ah! That's the easy part. You're going to come to find. Coming up with the methods, the measurements, and the sampling, these are going to be the hardest parts. Once we get through all of that and we have our data, throwing that into a statistical program and getting the analyses out, that's easy as can be. So if you're trying to emphasize things at this point, don't even worry about the statistical analysis yet. We'll figure that out. That's the easy part. Be thinking about the practical, pragmatic issues about what is going to be realistic for you in your situation right now. What capacity do you have for the design and implementation of a study? Now, I guess I can speak to some of the parts of that. The measurement tools. Now, there are multiple ways that you can go about this. So they will vary incredibly for every one of you. But again, trying to give you kind of generalized ideas about what this looks like. You absolutely do not have to develop a completely novel measurement tool. That is to say, if you are interested in people's obsessions of human interaction during COVID times and whatever, you don't have to sit down and try to construct, start to finish, a questionnaire of questions that pertain to attitudes towards microbes, attitudes towards, human contact and hand washing and mask wearing and all these different things. And then in addition to that, for that to be a good questionnaire, you can't just write out any question that pops into your head, right? We have to actually think through, how do you construct a question? How do we counterbalance questions? How do I positively word them and then negatively word them so that they counterbalance throughout the thing? And these questions need to be reverse coded, and these are forward coded, and these pertain to this dimension and this dimension. There's a lot of considerations, right? It's not enough to just be like, do you like wearing masks? This sort of thing. I'm being very generic here, but I hope you're getting the takeaway idea. So you're welcome to construct your own questionnaire or something like that, but please understand here at the front end, if that's the route that we're going to go, we're going to have to work at it. It's going to take time, and there's going to be a lot of considerations that go into it. Now, what are the alternatives to that? Well, as I already alluded to, you go to the literature. Hey, this research paper was exploring expressive symptoms of depression in relation to sleep, and they used the Beck Depression Inventory, or they used the Positive and Negative Affect Schedule, or they used the whatever, pick your favorite. You can use those same tools. As you find yourself sifting through the literature and finding the different ways that these different measurements have been used, why they used them, how they used them, what they got out of them, hopefully you start to get a better sense for what those tools are, what they tap into, and whether or not they're representative of the ideas as they currently sit in your head. Not every one of them is going to be perfect, and probably none of them is going to be perfect. But at the end of the day, when it comes to an established, published, consistently utilized inventory, questionnaire, whatever they want to call it, they should have all of that construction already taken care of. All of the items have been built with a very specific reason in mind. Validity scores, reliability scores, front coding, reverse coding, all of that should be taken care of. There should be entire papers already written that relate directly to the reliability, the validity, the item analysis, all of that as they relate to those things. So even if they're not the most perfect, precise measure that you would desire, they probably are well established enough where the utilization of them can be used alongside these other tools as well to get the picture that you're wanting to do. It's going to save you massive amounts of work, resources, time, headache, all of that. There is also the possibility that maybe that Beck depression inventory does not quite get at depression the way that you're wanting it to. It's close, but you really wish it could angle in a little more in this fashion. That's all right. We can make modifications to these things. So just briefly, say we want to use the Beck depression inventory, but you want to adapt it a little bit so that it does get at your question more adequately. That's fine. We can make those changes, make those adaptations, and at the end of the day, once we've done that, we present this in your paper and in your poster and whatever else. We say, great, materials. The Beck depression inventory, citation right here, was utilized but adapted in the following ways. And we give the reader a little explanation as to what modifications we made and why, what the rationale was. Those are perfectly acceptable routes to go about this too. So as you're developing these ideas, as you're making these choices and decisions about what you want to incorporate, what's relevant, what literature to look at, please know that those things are there for you to do. Those are all options. If you aren't sure, again, ask me. We're good. We can figure this out. The other big one that we're not there yet, but we will be real soon, and I want to plant this seed so that you're thinking about it now, which is we are going to gather data. So once we have constructed your experiment or your study, your correlational study, or whatever it's going to be, who are we going to look at? Where's that data going to come from? Now, 9 times out of 10, we're left standing here going, what? What do you mean who? There's not a ready-made population for us to just go to and start pulling people into a lab or in front of a computer or this sort of a thing, especially in a course like this and all of those limitations that I've already alluded to. So almost without exception, we're going to be working with some form of a convenience sample. 9 times out of 10, as I keep saying, most people in this course, what that ends up meaning is they construct their study, their whatever, and then they put it out to their social media. They put it out to their email listserv. They put it out to other classes that they're in. They put it out to their teammates. They put it out to, these are not great samples to work with if we're trying to be rigorous, thoughtful, and serious scientists. But that's not really what we're doing in a 10-week undergraduate course, right? We're just trying to walk this through and get enough of this under our belt so that we have things to work with. A convenient sample is perfectly acceptable. Sample sizes, I alluded to this a little bit ago, I think. Might have been in version 437 or 426, I don't know. Hopefully I said it in this video. But if we're doing an experiment, for instance, and doing a between subjects comparison, and we have 50 people, well, then we only have 25 compared to 25, which is great. But if you're imagining how you're going to get 50 people to engage in an experiment in the next handful of weeks, you probably already have a feel for how challenging that's likely to be. So again, we find ourselves at a place where correlational research, questionnaires, collections of inventories, answering questions, and then just accumulating that data becomes a far more tractable way to go about this. And no, it's not great to just sample your Facebook friends or your Instagram followers or your whatever, right? Your family from the holidays. But oh well. This isn't meant to be a thesis. We're not going to send this off for publication. You're not going to not get or get your degree based on this. We just need data to work with. So know that I'm not going to be a hard ass when it comes to sampling. At the end of the day, for our purposes here, this does not relate to your master's thesis or your anything that takes place in the real world. In our little fairy tale world that we're doing all of this, just getting warm bodies, for lack of a better description, is great. The more participants that we can get, the better. The more data we have, the better. So just start thinking about that now. We'll cross that bridge as we get to it, but these are all things that hopefully are starting to flood into your consciousness or at least seep in a little bit. And thinking about the practicality of what we're going to do in these coming weeks. Keeping it simple. I am not going to force anything on anyone as far as I really think you should do it this way or this is how I would do it or anything like that. I'm always here for guidance, suggestions, whatever the case is. But this is your project. And I guess what I am emphasizing is be realistic. Don't kill yourself trying to make this something more than what it needs to be. I have all the appreciation and respect and admiration for those who want to do quality work, who want to do it right. And the last thing in the world that I want this to sound like is that I'm saying don't worry about that. I want these to be good. I want these to be strong. I want all of that too. But I don't want you losing your mind. I don't want it impacting the quality of your life, your performance in your other classes, genuinely. I've seen this course, I've been through this course too many times. I've seen people set aspirations high and crash and burn because they were shooting a little too high. I've seen people shoot too low too. So while I know that I'm profoundly limited in my ability to just make it clear what too high or too low is, I hope that this rambling I've been doing over these past about half an hour now at least provides some guidance there, gives you some boundaries by which you can kind of make sense, I hope, of what I mean by these things. I will be, as I said early on, giving each and every one of you more exacting feedback as I go through your lab manuals, as I interact directly with your projects. Then it's much, much, much easier to be specific and to provide concrete guidance. I know this is very generalized, but nevertheless, I do hope it helps. At that stage, given that I have been talking for half an hour, I'm going to stop. So, be in touch or don't, it's up to you, but I'm here. I want to help. I'm trying to get on top of things as much as I can with the whole COVID and the hurdles of the first weeks and all that sort of stuff. But we're in it now, so do expect to be seeing me popping up into your projects and everything else here going forward. And I do hope everything's off to a good start for you, and we'll be in touch. All right, take care, everybody.